a cynical armed invasion of the largest energy facility in Europe. The seizure and occupation of the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant by Russian forces,
a blatant violation of international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions.
The mining and militarization of a high-risk facility.
Russia is a nuclear terrorist state.
Its methods of management have already brought the world to the brink of a new nuclear disaster.
There's not enough water for the normal operation of the ZNPP, and any scenario is possible.
And now, open plans to expropriate the property of another state.
Our main dream is, of course, to bring the plant up to full power as quickly as possible.
Russia plans to connect the seized Ukrainian nuclear power plant to its own power grid and use it for its own purposes. What does this mean for Ukraine and the world? Watch in our special report, Countdown to Disaster, Russia's attempt to seize Ukraine's atomic power station. Without qualified staff, without access for representatives of Ukrainian authorities and regulators, and, without oversight, over management methods. Europe's largest nuclear power plant, Ukrainian, has been in the hands of Russian military since March 2022. The Zaporizhzhia NPP was seized in the first days of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. 6 high-capacity reactors, placed under the control of people with automatic rifles. The plant was packed with military equipment and mined, turning it into a silent bomb, with consequences for all of Europe. And now they are literally trying to steal it, to use for their own purposes. These are satellite images published by Greenpeace. They show, since February 2025, Russia has laid more than 80 kilometres of power lines, installed about 300 poles. This is in fact the first confirmation of the Kremlin's plans to restart the seized Zaporizhzhia NPP.
The Russians are trying to build external transmission lines on the territory of temporarily occupied Ukraine, for example near Melitopol, in the direction of Mariupol.
The work pace is rapid. Between May 11th and 22nd, 2025, the occupiers erected 15 poles and laid 5 kilometres of transmission lines from the village of Topolin, north of Mariupol. Plans also include the construction of a modular pumping station, with a capacity of up to 80,000 cubic metres per hour. Without this, the reactors cannot be restarted. The Russians themselves destroyed the ZNPP's cooling system. They blew up the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant in June 2023, draining the reservoir.
There was some information that they were trying to install a floating pumping station, apparently to be placed in the middle of the cooling pond, to supply water locally to one of the reactors. But none of this was ever implemented. It was all sketched out hastily.
Electricity generated by the ZNPP, according to the Kremlin's plans, would be supplied to Crimea, to the temporarily occupied ports of Berdyansk and Mariupol, used by the occupiers for military purposes, as well as to regions of Russia.
In addition to their direct interest in increasing capacity for their southern regions, specifically Rostov region, for example, and Krasnodar Krai, I suspect, the primary goal is to supply the industrial potential of the occupied territories. That's Kherson region, Zaporizhzhia region, Donetsk region, which cannot operate without additional electrical capacity, and the Russians have nowhere else to get it except from the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant.
The seizure and forcible retention of a Ukrainian nuclear power plant is a violation of international humanitarian law. The Geneva Conventions prohibit attacks on such non-military facilities. The ZNPP has always been used solely for generating electricity for peaceful purposes. Furthermore, all nuclear power plants during wartime must be inviolable. No military equipment may be placed on their territory. Their work must be maintained without interruption. Equipment preserved intact, personnel kept safe. Operations aimed at preventing radiation incidents, both expropriation and use of such facilities for the benefit of the occupying state are prohibited. Russia cynically ignores these norms and is preparing for the so-called legalization of its control over the seized Ukrainian nuclear plant. Preparations are underway to restart the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant in spring 2025. on the orders of Deputy Head of the Russian Presidential Administration, Sergei Kirienko. According to the Occupation Administration, the power units have already passed inspection by a Rostekhnadzor commission and are awaiting licenses for the first and second reactors. Despite Rosatom's earlier assurances to the IAEA that the plant would remain idle until the war ends, the ultimate goal is clear.
Our greatest ambition is, of course, to bring the plant up to full capacity as soon as possible and begin generating electricity.
The construction of a floating pumping station to supply water to the Zaporizhzhia NPP cooling pond eliminates the main technical barrier to restarting the plant and securing approval from the Russian regulator.
It's clear why Russia is doing this. This is their way of trying to legalize what they stole. They want to present the station as if it is already unquestionably theirs.
Russia has seized it, but it is still the territory of Ukraine. The Zaporizhzhia NPP is Ukrainian. They held fake referendums there and are now somehow trying to structure things to obtain a license. So yes, we understand that there is activity underway, but in terms of approach and compliance with international safety principles, this is an utterly worthless process.
Russia has been preparing for the expropriation of the Ukrainian nuclear plant since 2022, when Putin signed a decree transferring the Zaporizhzhia NPP into Russian ownership and recognizing Ukrainian licenses as valid until 2028. All of this is illegal.
The plant and its power units are Ukrainian. They operate under the laws of the Ukrainian regulator and Ukrainian nuclear energy. No other rules, norms, or laws of Rosatom can apply on this territory. The risks here are far more global for us. This is the loss, first of all, of our capacity, industrially, economically, socially, and in humanitarian terms. This is not just industry. It is life support for people. And it also strengthens the military potential of the Russian Federation. All of this is a violation of international humanitarian law, of the Geneva Conventions, and therefore entails responsibility before the highest international court. All key personnel, starting from the head of state, including the head of Rosatom, the head of Rostekhnadzor, down to individual employees of Russian nuclear plants, must be held accountable and punished.
If the occupiers connect the Ukrainian NPP to the Russian energy grid, it will set a precedent in history. When one state seized the nuclear facility of another and used it for its own purposes.
It's not so simple to integrate the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant into Russia's power grid without creating additional risks, environmental, operational, and so on. The attempts to carry out this order from Putin and Kirienko are simply dangerous and pose enormous risks for the region, for Europe as a whole, and for the nuclear energy sector globally. Psychologically speaking, after Chernobyl and Fukushima, the nuclear industry might not withstand a third shock. The entire global nuclear safety system is currently under threat, under attack, under aggression from the Russian Federation.
Nevertheless, the occupiers plan to restart the Zaporizhzhia plant, despite the condition of the facility and the absence of qualified staff. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, Russia has violated key nuclear safety principles here: the plant's physical integrity, the functioning of safety systems and uninterrupted power supply, radiation monitoring, communication with the Ukrainian regulator, and the working conditions of Ukrainian personnel, who remain under constant pressure from the occupiers. Under these conditions, restarting even a single power unit could lead to catastrophe.
The Zaporizhzhia NPP has not undergone maintenance for 3.5 years. We cannot even say for certain what might already be malfunctioning there. I work at the Institute for Safety Problems of Nuclear Power Plants, where we are developing scenarios of explosions at a hypothetical nuclear facility as a result of military aggression. We have identified 68 different scenarios. Any of them could happen.
Inside the reactors and in the spent fuel pools, there is a very large amount of nuclear material. All of it poses a direct threat.
the Zaporizhzhia NPP has 6 Soviet-built VVER-1000 reactors, the same type as in Russia. Ukraine has modernized its own reactors, with some converted to use American nuclear fuel. The occupiers are unfamiliar with this technology. An operator's mistake could lead to severe consequences.
An accident could occur with a small release confined to the plant site, requiring shutdown and decontamination. Or there could be an accident releasing radionuclides into the atmosphere, into groundwater, or into the Dnipro River, which would contaminate virtually all of southern Ukraine.
The current plant staff can hardly be called professional. Most qualified Ukrainian nuclear specialists left Enerhodar at the start of the war. Russia has brought in its own personnel.
The so-called specialists they brought from their own plants are not specialists at all. They are very weak, because no plant director would send their best staff away to work somewhere else. They send the ones they don't need.
At any moment, the so-called management practices at the plant could lead to unpredictable consequences. Russian troops constantly shell the NPP they themselves control, blaming Ukraine for sabotage. On July 12, 2025, gunfire continued on the plant's grounds for an hour. IAEA inspectors later found hundreds of small-caliber shell casings near the power units.
Such military activity at or near a major nuclear power plant is absolutely unacceptable. Rafael Grossi, head of the International Atomic Energy Agency. When it comes to the safety of the plant as a complex technological facility, the greatest danger it faces is the presence of unqualified armed personnel on its grounds. In other words, representatives of the occupying forces, people who have no understanding of where they are, who do not know the safety protocols. And this risk must, without question, be eliminated.
Shelling of the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant has not ceased since the start of the war. As a result, the plant has repeatedly suffered complete blackouts and dozens of near losses of external power. Without stable electricity, the reactor cores would begin to melt, triggering a release of radioactive materials.
This is nuclear terrorism against the people of Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, and European partners.
This is one of the tools of psychological pressure, aimed not only at people living now in Enerhodar, in Nikopol, and throughout Zaporizhzhia region, who are undoubtedly afraid of the situation at the plant, but also at the entire country, keeping Ukraine in a state of tension over nuclear and radiological safety.
In August 2022, Russian forces struck the site storing spent nuclear fuel containers.
Under all IAEA regulations, even the mere presence of people in uniform, any militarized formations on the territory of a nuclear facility is prohibited. This is a violation. Russia must be excluded from the club of nuclear states entitled to build or operate anything in this field.
In the summer of 2023, the occupiers began using the seized plant's grounds to train FPV drone pilots. And in 2024, the Russians set fire to the Zaporizhzhia plant's cooling tower, a massive reinforced concrete structure that cools technical water and ensures the safe operation of the nuclear facility. Setting it ablaze is no easy feat, as water runs down its walls.
Now, with Russian troops stationed there, they are not operating it properly as required, so all the equipment has dried out. And according to our information, they also set up a warehouse of ammunition and fuel and lubricants inside, and something went wrong, and it caught fire.
In addition, the occupiers have halted the automatic transfer of radiation level data from the plant to Ukraine, mined the perimeter, set up firing positions, and restricted access to the site.
On top of that, these barriers, checkpoints, and so on create a problem for carrying out emergency preparedness and response functions.
Currently, all 6 reactors at the Zaporizhzhia plant are in cold shutdown and produce no electricity. Ukraine, despite shelling and obstruction from Russian forces, continues to supply the plant with power to keep its critical safety systems running and prevent the irreversible. But any unauthorized reconnection to Russia's energy grid and any attempt to restart even a single reactor would mark the countdown to a new nuclear disaster.
Then, the temperature in the reactor core rises, and the coolant in the core, which is water, begins to heat. If the fuel's integrity is breached, whether from stress or another cause, radioactive products enter the water boils, and there is a risk of aerosol release. Under these conditions, restarting is practically impossible and dangerous from the standpoint of nuclear and radiological safety. Safety would not be ensured.
Restart of the Zaporizhzhia plant is only possible under the authority of the Ukrainian nuclear regulator and only after repair of the reactors and systems, inspection of nuclear fuel in the reactors, and resolution of the station's water supply issues.
The equipment in the reactor units already requires maintenance, on schedule, at set intervals, to keep it in working condition. This is not being done. The scheduled maintenance of safety systems and safety critical systems is not being carried out. Technical inspections, repairs, replacements, overhauls, none of this is happening.
According to Ukraine's nuclear regulator, this will take years to address, and only after Russian troops withdraw from the plant, the area is demined, and Ukraine regains full control.
It must be fully demilitarized. There must be no military personnel, no one in uniform, and certainly no weapons. Only Ukraine can ensure nuclear safety at this facility and in the region as a whole. Without question, we cannot allow Russia to occupy the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant for a year, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years. This must not be allowed.
From the first days of Russia's seizure of the plant, Kyiv has demanded its demilitarization, the first and main point of the peace formula. Only Ukrainian nuclear engineers can prevent a catastrophe like Chernobyl. On April 26, 1986, during a failed experiment, an explosion occurred at Chernobyl's fourth reactor. Around 11 tons of radioactive material were released into the atmosphere. Millions of people were affected, and over 200,000 square kilometers of land were contaminated. The reactors and storage facilities at the Zaporizhzhia plant hold 10 times more spent nuclear fuel than Chernobyl ever did, meaning the consequences would be far more devastating. The Russians ignore the lessons of the largest man-made disaster in human history, and all calls to demilitarize the Zaporizhzhia plant.
Такой демилитаризации никто, кроме самой Украины, никогда и не вел никакой речи.
International organizations, particularly the UN and IAEA, have called on Russia to return the plant to full Ukrainian control. The idea of demilitarization is supported throughout the civilized world. Washington proposed that Russia withdraw from the plant, returning it to Ukraine but under US administration. Russia has rejected all such appeals, declaring the plant a Russian nuclear facility.
This is absolutely unacceptable. The global community must stand with Ukraine. It must declare that Russia is a nuclear terrorist, that it cannot simply seize another country's nuclear facilities, claim them as its own, and terrorize the plant's workers. This must be a separate case for The Hague. I will remind you, any threat of nuclear impact in any form is prohibited, and we have heard it from the Russians. Dirty bomb threats, explosions at civilian sites, and manipulations involving spent nuclear fuel. We have seen that the Russians actively use nuclear threats as a method of pressure.
Ukrainian law enforcement has identified 3 Russian generals who commanded the seizure of the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant. They and their accomplices have been formally charged in absentia for violating the laws and customs of war by prior conspiracy as part of a group. Ukrainian human rights defenders, together with international colleagues, are documenting the violations and crimes Russia is committing at the occupied Ukrainian facility to preserve the evidence for future international justice.
Unfortunately, I have a very strong suspicion that when Russia begins to withdraw from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, it will unscrew, dismantle, break off, and rip out everything it possibly can and haul it away to sell somewhere, just as they stole toilets from villages in Kyiv region.
Russia and its rulers will not escape responsibility for the crimes committed in Ukraine and against Ukraine, including all acts carried out at the seized Ukrainian nuclear plant, and even more so, for the lawlessness, reckless conduct and outright abuse that threaten the gravest consequences for the entire world. The occupation of the Zaporizhzhia NPP, the forcible seizure and preparations for expropriation, despite the risk of a new disaster, is an act of nuclear terrorism against the whole world by the Russian Federation, and it is also crude banditry and extortion on an imperial scale. Russia's war against Ukraine has shown, instead of building and developing its own, the Kremlin prefers to brazenly and cynically steal what belongs to others. Valentina Lukianets, Special Report.